Hey guys, short video today, but it should be quite fun. I've got 3 games, all of which ended in like the first 15 moves with killer attacks. So the lesson here to learn is that when you get the opportunity for a decisive attack, you need to go for it. So let's go with this first one. This is a 10-minute blitz game. I'm playing Gujada from Argentina. And I'm playing with the white pieces, so I start with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. So far, so standard. And what I've been trying, what I'm starting to try recently is the Scotch game, or the Scotch gambit. So, Scotch game goes with d4, so tempting black to take, then knight can take. In the normal Scotch game, but the Scotch gambit, you don't recapture immediately. You use that time, that move, instead to get the light square bishop out, and obviously we are paying our attentions to the weak f7 square. Black comes out with the bishop as well, and I decide to go straight in with the knight. That also frees up f3 for my queen. Knight comes out to h6, which is fairly typical. It's just, you know, one way that black has to defend the king's pawn on f7. So I bring my queen in. So I've now got 3 attackers on f7, and black has 3 defenders. Knight, no, he just has 2 defenders actually, knight and then the king. So he brings in another knight. This is a really good move. So he's not only defending f7, he's also attacking my queen and my light square bishop. That's a really good move, and one that I missed. So I move my queen across where it's defending the bishop. Black moves his queen out, again defending f6 and also starting to look down at my king side. I castle to defend that, takes bishop, recapture, and black plays d7 in order to release his light square bishop. Okay, and the game is going to end in the next 4 turns, so 8 moves. Okay, so there's a check. c6 is played to block the check, and I move my queen back here to d3, where it's defending my loose pawn there on e4, which is currently only defended by the knight. The knight itself is still defended by my dark square bishop. Black castles kingside, and so now you see the point of the queen to d3 move. Can you spot the tactic that we have here? Now this is probably not a tactic that would work in a longer time format when you've got time to figure stuff out, but for blitz it's perfectly good. So the first move is e5. So there I'm doing 2 things. I'm clearing the path for my queen here to h7, which would be checkmate, and I'm also attacking the queen at the same time. Now my opponent missed that move, and because he's just castled, right? But I figure if he castles, and he's not likely to castle now on the queen side because he's moved this c-pawn, I'm thinking if he castles, then I have this tactic: attack the queen. He doesn't think about it, and then the queen goes in. There you go, checkmate. So that's our first game. Second game is a 30-minute rapid, and I'm playing Chacota Benas from, is that the Philippines, I think? Okay, so I'm playing black here. Opens with d4, the queen's pawn. I respond f6, very typical, knight to c3, and d5. So it's pretty much a kind of mirror image of what we saw in the last game. And the dark square bishop here comes out. So, you know, this knight obviously is only 2 jumps away from c7. So I decide to push the c-pawn. Now this is very different. You don't do this, you really don't want to do this too much on the king side and push the f-pawn forward. That's why the f-pawn is called the forget about it pawn, right? You don't want to push that one because the f-pawn for both sides of the board is important for king protection. Right? Pushing that pawn opens up a diagonal towards your king, which could be exploited by, say, the opponent's queen. So if my queen was to dive into h4, or his dives into h5 with check and maybe a fork. But this is very different on the queen side, because pushing that queen's wing pawn there, the c pawn, actually opens up the diagonal for my queen to get out. White plays h3 to take g4 away from my knight and my light square bishop, so it's a decent defensive move. I bring my bishop out to the Italian style square as well, and white plays e3, just shoring up his d4 pawn, also then releasing his own queen and light square bishop. So all good solid moves so far. I do the same. We've got a fairly similar position. White moves a3 to prevent my dark square bishop now from coming out to b4. So I put my dark square bishop now. If you see what we've got here, I've actually done like a reverse London system. If you play the London system, you can also play it as black. It can work very well. So I move my dark square bishop to the d6 square, where it's now facing off against white's dark square bishop. I figure that he's developed his bishop. If he takes mine, my queen goes to d6, and it's got it's a fairly good square for the queen. He decides not to go for the exchange, so I push h6. I don't want his bishop pinning my knight against the queen, and he moves the f pawn. He moves the forget about it pawn, and so he may be preparing e4. That's a thought. Although I've got 3 pieces looking down on that particular square. So I decide to open things up. I'm thinking I can always castle queenside if I need to, but let's put some pressure on this bishop. Bishop comes in to e5. So now obviously I have an opportunity. The only defender of that bishop is a pawn. If I take the pawn, if I capture the bishop, pawn on d4 recaptures. So he's got double pawns, but they're in the middle of the board. And then obviously the pawn will be attacking my knight, so I would need to do something about my knight. So do I want to do this? I go ahead for the exchange. I figure that the double pawns is at least a target. Now where do I send my knight? I went for g8 in the end. The other option would have been d7. But there isn't really much of a future for that knight over here, I reckoned. White comes out swinging with g4, attacking my light square bishop. I simply move it back. So now looking at white's made a lot of pawn moves, right? And the board, particularly on the king side, is starting to look a bit flaky with lots of gaps there. He pushes the f pawn now again, and I bring my queen in. I spot that e3 is hanging because the knight is there's just no defender of it at all. Does white spot this? There's actually 2 hanging pawns as well, because b2 as well as hanging. So he pushes b2, b3 to protect that one, but missed this one. Okay, and now the other thing to notice in this situation is that the knight there on e2 is now pinned, and it's the only defender of this knight. So if I could find a way to attack the knight on c3, it actually has no defender. White makes another pawn push, and I go in and grab the pawn here on f4. The only defender of that pawn is the knight on e2. The knight on e2 cannot move. It's illegal because it's an absolute pin against the king. So now I'm thinking there's an attacking opportunity here. White's position, the weaknesses are starting to show. When you've got something that flaky, it doesn't take much for it to start to crumble. So I'm thinking, let's push this pawn up the board. So white plays h5, attacking my light square bishop. I am unconcerned because I realise I can push my pawn to f3. The knight cannot move, the knight is pinned, so I'm at least going to win a piece. And I also realise that f3 to f2 would be a lovely checkmate. The question is, my opponent, with 24 minutes 50 seconds still on his clock, does he notice that? And he doesn't. He decides to be greedy. He goes for the material, and then pawn to f2 is a very, very satisfying checkmate. Let's look at the third game. In this one, I'm playing a Siklas from Norway, and I'm playing with the white pieces. I start with e4, e5, knight to f3, and knight to f6. This is known as the Russian or the Petrov defense, and it's not something that I'm very familiar with. So I bring my other knight out. The standard move is actually to capture the pawn on e5. The other knight comes out, so now we have the 4 knights game on the board. I bring my bishop out to the Italian variation, and black comes in and captures my pawn. So I'm thinking, you know, the fool has just given up a piece, so I recapture with my knight, not realizing that he has a d5 with a fork on my knight and my bishop. So what am I going to do? I have to move one of the pieces out of the way. Well, I'm going to lose one of them anyway. So I decide my bishop at this point is probably a stronger piece. So I move it to b5, pinning his knight. Pawn takes. I capture the knight with check. Pawn recaptures. Now look at the board. Black has 2 pairs of doubled pawns. Right? He's 1 pawn up. I've lost that 1 pawn. But in theory, this looks like a very nice game. And of course, the pawn on e5 is hanging. So I can go in and regain my pawn that I was down. Didn't spot this move. Queen comes out. It's not with check, but it is attacking both my knight and the pawn on g2. So I go ahead and just grab a little bit more material. The queen comes in with the attack. I need to protect my rook, and I move it into f1. Obviously, there's a risk here, which is that my king is now running out of spaces to move to. Black comes in with the bishop attacking my queen. My queen also has very little movement. Pawn takes, getting ready to play f3 to f2 with check and a discovered attack on the queen, winning the queen and the game. So, in fact, I think it would be checkmate. It would be checkmate, pawn to f2. So at that point, I resigned, and I'd spent 2 minutes on all of my moves up to that point. So, you know, just 3 fun games, 3 nice creative attacks. When you get the opportunity for these things, you simply need to go for it. I do realise actually at this point that I do have rook to f2 as an option, which would stop the pawn's advance. But then if rook to f2, queen down here, rook comes back, then the pawn can come in, and it's looking very, very unpleasant. That would be checkmate, yeah. So yeah, 3 games. Hope you've enjoyed these. I always enjoy playing them, and I'll see you next time.